Hi, this is Melissa Nilsson with the Santa Clarita Valley Quilt Guild, and I'll be showing you how to make our April 2021 block of the month, the bordered monkey wrench. So this center part is a monkey wrench or churn dash block, and then we have these borders around the outsides. So for this, you'll need to cut one 2.5-inch square of a color that's going to go in the middle there. 4 2.5-inch squares of your background, your white or light colored background, which are going to be these pieces here. You'll need 4 3.5 by 6.5-inch rectangles, which become these outer sides on the border. And you'll need 4 3.5-inch squares of a dark color for these outer corners. So what that leaves then is these 4 corners of your monkey wrench, which you need half square triangles for. So to make those half square triangles, you're going to need 2 3-inch squares that are your background color, and 2 3-inch squares that are your darker color. So we're going to start by showing you how to make these half square triangles out of these 2 sets of squares. So the first step is you're going to draw a line diagonally on each of your lighter colored 3-inch squares from corner to corner. You can use a pencil, pen, anything. It doesn't really matter what you use because you're going to end up cutting right on that line. You're going to sew a 1/4 inch away from that line on both sides. So if you don't have a 1/4 inch foot on your sewing machine, you'll need to draw another set of lines that are 1/4 inch away from that center line. So when you go to the sewing machine, you're going to sew on these lines that are 1/4 inch away from the center. Do that on both of your squares. And then you're going to put your fabrics right sides together and take them to the sewing machine to sew. So again, you're going to sew 1/4 inch away from that center line. And I do mine as chain piecing, so I just keep right on going on the second one. And then you flip it around and do it on the other side. And trim your threads. Then we'll take these over and iron them down. I just give a quick press to get the bubbles out. And then we're going to cut them apart, and you're going to cut right on that first line that you drew, that center line. So the 1/4 inch line on your ruler ought to be right on your sewn line. The edge of the ruler is going to be on the original drawn line that goes right down the center of your squares. And you cut them apart, and that gives you 4 half square triangles. So we're going to open those up and press them. Press towards the dark side. And these are a little bit big, so we're going to need to trim them. And as we trim them, it will take care of these little dog ears, so you don't have to trim those off ahead of time. Okay, so to trim these, you want to trim them down to 2.5 inches. What you want to do is this 45-degree line on your ruler, you want to lay right on the seam line on your half square triangle. You want the area of your ruler where the 1 and 1 are together in the top right corner. You lay your ruler down so that your diagonal line rests on that seam line. And then so long as you can see fabric beyond the 2.5 inch line on the left and bottom sides, then you won't cut it too small. You'll be okay. If you need to move it, you just move it both top and right at the same time to keep that diagonal line along your seam line. And so long as you can see fabric completely within that 2.5 inch area on your ruler, you won't cut it too small. Then you're going to trim on the right and along the top. Then you take it up, spin it around. Again, you're going to lay that diagonal line of your ruler right along your seam line. But now you also want to make sure that the 2.5 inch lines on your ruler line up along the edge of your fabric. And again, you cut the right and the top. So you can see we have a perfectly trimmed 2.5 inch square. And now you're going to repeat that process with the other 3. I'll do one more here with you and then we'll move on. So my diagonal line is lined up with the seam line of my fabric. I make sure that I have fabric all the way within the 2.5 inch square on my ruler. And I trim the right and the top. Flip it around so that what was previously the top right corner is now the bottom left corner. And I line up my ruler so that the edges of my fabric are right along the 2.5 inch line on the left and bottom, and the 45-degree angle line is resting right on my fabric. And I cut the right and the top, and then that one's done. All right, I'm going to trim my other 2, and I'll be back in a moment. The next step is to lay out our block, and then we're going to sew all the rows together. You're going to make 2 9-patch blocks. As you lay out your pieces, lay them right sides up. Now with batiks, it's often really difficult to tell what is the correct side, what's the wrong side. On this particular batik, one side is, and it's hard to get the camera to focus here, but one side is a little bit less defined. This side has a bit more, the lines aren't quite as crisp on this side. So I'm going to call that side my right side. We had laid this out earlier, and now we just need to add our half square triangles. The half square triangles, the point is going to point in towards the center. If you know, these can get turned any way, and it's very easy to turn them the wrong way. So lay them with the points going towards the center. And after I do that, I always then take my pattern and I hold it up next to my block and I visually check that I have it going the correct direction. That saves a lot of seam ripping later. So the next step is we're going to sew our 2 9 patches. You're going to sew the churn dash or the monkey wrench first. You're going to take the 3 right side and flip them over to the center. And then you're going to sew a 1/4 inch along this right edge. Be very careful that you take them to the sewing machine in the way that you've pulled them up so that you don't end up sewing along an incorrect edge. Alright, now I'm going to sew right along the right edge at a 1/4 inch. And I'm going to chain piece, so I'm going to take my next piece. Keep on going, and then my 3rd piece. Clip apart your pieces, open them up, and then what I do is set them back in over here into my laid out block. I just do a quick little finger press here, pressing towards the dark on each of these pieces. By doing that, you'll end up getting good nesting when you go to sew your rows together. So I set them out here again. I make sure that I have my half square triangles pointing in towards the middle. And now I'm going to take my left side pieces and bring them to the center, and I will sew them onto each of these to complete those rows. And again, I'll chain piece these, so I'll just bring the next one up. And the 3rd one. And I'll clip them apart, and I'll bring them back to my, well, first I'll press them. So again, press them towards the dark side, and that will allow good nesting on your rows. And just a quick reminder on pressing, you want to just down and press. You don't want to go like this. If you're putting pressure on as you're going, sliding across your fabric, you may end up stretching your fabric. So just down and press, and then you just lightly pull that top over, then you come down and press. I do put a little bit of tension as I fold over the seam allowance so that I get a nice straight line here right at my seam, and as opposed to having some buckling of the fabric. And then again, we're pressing towards the blue. And now we're going to sew these 3 rows together. So I take my middle, I flip it towards the bottom, and then I line up the seams, and I pull back the top piece to make sure that my seams are lined up. I do that both at the top and the bottom. The reason I do it also at the bottom is because if the bottom gets skewed like that, when you go to line it up with its neighboring blocks, then it could be wonky. So if you're always lining up your top and your bottom seams, it helps keep everything aligned properly. So as I get close to that first seam, I'm going to stop and again pull it back and make sure that my seam is lined up. And as soon as I get past it, I'm going to stop and I'm going to look at the second one. And it looks like I need to just tug a little bit on the bottom to get those to nest nicely. Once I pull it out, I can put my finger right here and I can feel it sitting nicely as opposed to one seam on top of the other. And then I'll add my top row. So I bring it in, I check that my corner is going the right direction. I flip the top to the middle. I line up the seams. I pull it back and look and make sure the seams are aligned. Again, just before I get to the first seam, I'm going to check and make sure it looks okay. Before I come to the second seam, I'm going to check and make sure it looks okay. I'm going to put my finger right there and feel that it feels nice and flat. That tells me that the top one isn't sitting on top of the bottom one. And then I'm going to pull it off and press it open. So I open it up and there's my little churn dash. Now when I press this on the, I don't have to worry about whether I press these out or in because the border that I'm going to put around it, these seams won't mesh up with seams on that border. So this side looks like it wants to go in towards the center, so I'm going to go ahead and let it do what it wants to do and go in towards the center. Flip it around and do the same. And now that churn dash is ready to go in the middle of the larger block. And again, you're just sewing a 9 patch. So you're going to make sure that all your corner pieces are right sides up. And again, with batiks it's hard, but find the side that looks a little bit crisper in its print. And flip it over right sides together with the middle pieces. On these ones, you're not worried about trying to align seams. So it's just a straight sew all the way down the edges on all 3. I'm going to pause, go ahead and do that, and then come back. Okay, so I've sewn my 3 pieces on. I'm going to fold them back and just do a little finger press to hold them in place. So on the outer pieces, I'm going to go out to the outside. On the inner pieces, I'm going to go into the middle. And it's not going to want to go into the middle because of these 2 little seams here. So I'm just going to turn it over and press on those seams, and that will help convince it to go to the middle. Now you might ask, why don't I do it the other way? Why don't I have these ones go to the outside and these to the inside? Well, over here we have the blue material, the blue fabric, and it's going to create a little bit of a shadow here. So that's why I decided to, on these outer blocks, press out towards the outside on the blues. Okay, so we just now finish up our rows. We're going to take, let me move my camera here a little bit. We're going to take these outer pieces, again making sure they're right sides up, flip them to the middle pieces, and then we're going to sew the 1/4 inch down each of these seams. I'll do that and come back. Alright, I have my 3 pieces on. I'm going to press them. On the top and bottom rows, I'm pressing, oops, get over here in the camera range. I'm pressing towards the blue side. And on the middle, on my churn dash, I'm going to press in towards the middle. So I don't have my iron all the way down, I have it slightly up, and I use the edge of the iron to press over those seams, and then I press down. So I sort of knock the edges over, either with my finger or the iron, and then I, holding the iron up, I knock the edge over and I press down. I'm giving just a little bit of tension with my left hand, but you don't want to pull too much because it's easy to stretch your fabric and then your blocks won't line up. I bring it to the front, and I press those seams from the front as well. And then on this final one, pressing out towards the blue. Okay, and our last step is to put our 3 rows together in this outer 9 patch. Making sure all your pieces are right side up. Take your bottom row, flip it to your middle row, lining up your seams. Again, looking both at the top and the bottom where you're going to sew. I always peel mine back, check to make sure that my seams line up. You know, I don't generally use pins. Sometimes I'll use those the little clips. Once I get a seam lined up, I'll clip the seam. If you like to use pins, by all means pin. When I get to larger pieces like this, I do tend to use a clip to help it stay together as I take it to the sewing machine. So again, I'm going to check this side over here, the seam, and make sure it's lined up and clip it. And then I'll bring it over to sew. Be right back. Okay, I have my bottom row on, and now I'll flip my top row to the center. I'll pull back and check my seams. Oh, look here, on this one, I'm a little bit off, but I'll be able to tug on that as I sew. I'll show you how to do that. When I check down here, those look good. I'll go ahead and put my clips in, right on those seams to hold them. And let me move the camera. Okay, so my first seam here is lined up pretty well. I can feel it nesting nicely there underneath my finger, so I'm going to go ahead and sew past that first one. I can see my half square triangle, the shadow of it underneath my top fabric here. So I'm just going to make sure that as I sew that I'm within a 1/4 inch of that, so that I don't tip off that tip of the triangle. And again here with the second one. Okay, now I'm getting close to my second seam, and they're a little bit apart. So what I'm going to do is I'm just gently going to tug on that bottom fabric to get them to line up. And then press my finger there to hold them together. And then sew to the end. And there we go. We have our finished block. And if you've cut accurately and sewn accurately and pressed accurately, you won't have cut off the tips of your churn dash. So now we're going to press these final seams. Again, we're going to press towards the blue so that we don't get that shadow. And then the last thing we're going to do is measure our block. This is especially important if you're doing a block for a group event like our block of the month, where multiple people are putting blocks together. But even in your own quilting, it's important to do because it makes the process of putting the quilt top together so much easier. So you want to make sure that your block ends up, in this case, our blocks are supposed to be 12.5 inches, so you want to make sure that your block is 12.5 inches long, on both sides. Sorry with the camera there. So what happens if it's not? Well, this one is okay because at least the blue squares are right on my lines. So when I go to put another block with it, I can at least line up the blue squares. Does that make sense? The fact that the white is a little shy is fine because when I go sew my seam, I'll sew a 1/4 inch. I'll have a little bit of a short seam allowance here, but it's well within the 1/4 inch, so it'll work fine. If your block is more than an 1/8 inch shy, or is an 1/8 inch or less shy, you can spray some heavy starch on it and then press it, and as you press, you're going to stretch it, and you can stretch it out and get it to be the right size. If it's a 1/4 inch or more too small, you need to take it apart and use a shorter seam allowance on all your seams to make it bigger. If it's too big, well, a block like this, you can just trim off the excess because there's no points here you have to worry about on any of the sides. On this middle block, if it was too big, well, if you trim it, you would end up having less than a 1/4 inch for your points, so you'd end up having cut off points. So a block that has triangle points on the ends, in order to shorten that, you'll want to go back to your seams and do an extra needle width to just kind of pull that in just a little bit. So hopefully you found that helpful, and we'll see you on the next one.